mean, it looks like 10% maybe. Today, there's about 1 in 3 Floridians is a native of Florida. I got the idea simply, by 2010, I'm thinking, oh my God, what a decade. And decades are interesting for historians. Not all decades fit neatly. The 1920s is a perfect example of one that does. Opened with prosperity, ended with the Great Depression. The 1950s, for instance, may seem so, but in some ways the 1950s ended with Kennedy's assassination. The 60s ended sometime in the early 70s. But this period is a perfect fit. 2000, there was a great deal of confidence. In fact, I'm struck as I go out, and I'll ask you later about your level of confidence, but in the year 2000, 2 things were going on. One was, it was the 3rd consecutive year of a federal balanced budget. Will your grandchildren ever see a federal balanced budget? No. And secondly, they asked Floridians, how many of you are confident about the state you're living in? And 2 in 3 Floridians said yes. I'll ask you at the end, rather than the beginning, so keep that question in mind. But just think of the tripwire, the 2000 election, 9/11, the 2004 election, basically the shattering of the cratering of the Democratic Party in Florida began at this time. By the end of the decade, there had not been a Florida governor elected in the new century. And today, there's not a single statewide elected Democrat. You have to go back to the 1870s to find that. That's how dramatic it is. But there's far more than politics. I mean, there's some fascinating characters. I also talk about the Great Recession, which was shattering as well. The opioid crisis, homelessness crisis, drugs. I mean, so let me get started here. And I'm just going to talk about, I don't like the title of the book. My choice was Tropic of Crazy. The problem is, what does that mean? I mean, you could argue Dreams of the New Century. What does that mean? But regardless. I hope this talk ends better than the last talk I gave. Not here, but a couple of years ago, I'm in Naples, Florida. And it must be 4 times this many people there. About the same demographic. And before I begin, this kind little lady said, we bet you could help solve a debate we've been having. We know that people from Naples, Neapolitans, live longer than anyone else in Florida. And she's right, by the way, the longevity there. And then she said, some of us think it's the water, and others think it's the air. What do you think? And they said, well, it's probably because you're rich. And I insulted her. I said, and in France, you feel privileged if I call you rich. I mean, they were really mad. We're not rich. Everyone calls us rich. I said, no, come on, you don't need a sociologist to tell you that you have better diet, better medical care. And by the way, Naples is still number 1. But so imagine if this were 1922, and I came to town as a fortune teller. Which of the following predictions about Florida 100 years later would be the zaniest? Just stop it. You're just over the top. Which is the zaniest? That we have the air conditioning on in January. No, that you would be able to spend an August evening in Florida without sweating or swatting. That's about, I mean, no one, there were a few air conditioners in Florida, but generally department stores and the best movie theater in town. That'd be interesting if Seminole had a single air conditioner in 1940s. Was there a movie theater that grand here that it would, because it was, air conditioning was quite expensive, that you'd survive a summer without mosquitoes. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that the solution was DDT. That you could drive nonstop from Miami to Pensacola, although everyone knows there's no way you can drive nonstop to Orlando. And by the way, this is Tampa. No, it's not. What city? Oh, come back. That someday we'd be playing professional Major League Baseball in an air-conditioned stadium. What are you? That's first of all, why would Major League Baseball come to Tampa, Florida? And why would no one's ever built an air-conditioned? What's an air-conditioned stadium? That there would be ice hockey in Florida. Come on, why are we playing ice hockey here? This is not Canada. And by the way, I'm not the first prophet here. In the 1850s, Jules Verne, actually 1869, in his book From the Earth to the Moon, predicted, I'm not making this up, in the book, the launch site is a place called Stone Hill, Florida, which apparently was outside Tampa, where the launch took place. And there is no Stone Hill, but no one's ever done research. Why would Jules Verne select Florida and then create the name Stone Hill outside Tampa? That Orange and Osceola counties, in 1920, they had about 22,000 people. Today, their population is about 2 million. Are you kidding? That is astonishing. I mean, just which is more flabbergasting than the next? That the happiest place on earth would have been a cypress slough in Orange County, Florida. And that's my only political gesture. By the way, Ron DeSantis and my grandparents both came from Sicily. Seriously. That the son of Flora Collin and Elias Disney would be the most famous Floridian of all. It's a great story. Flora Call and Elias Disney were the first married couple, and I've forgotten the name, Lake County. If you go to the courthouse there in Tavares, they'll pull out this goatskin bound volume, and it's, I think, November 1890, or 1889, I think it is. And the freezes of that decade drove them out, and they moved to Chicago, where Elias helped tear down the World's Fair, but fearful that Chicago would corrupt his sons, Walt and what was the other son's name? Roy. They moved to Marceline, Missouri, in north central Missouri. And I always ask audiences, how many of you have been to Marceline, Missouri? I think there's one person, but actually, I'm betting almost everyone here why. Does anyone know the riddle? This is Marceline, Missouri, Main Street Disney. It's Walt's vision of childlike fantasies of growing up. And thus the question is there who among us has never been to Disneyland or Disney World? What member of the Communist Party has infiltrated Seminole? But I mean, seriously, everyone here has been to Disney. What does that tell you about Florida? That the Seminole tribe, the poorest tribe in the 1820s and the 1920s, would now be the wealthiest group in Florida today. Principally because of this man, Chief James Billy. It's all about gambling, Seminole gambling. That Seminole, Florida would be groveless. Am I right? There's not a single grove. I don't think there's a single grove left in Pinellas County. That's one of the funny things about the Saturday market in St. Petersburg, the biggest in Florida. There's not a farm or grove left in Pinellas. I mean, Florida greets the new millennium. How interesting. I mean, think of this. So 2000 is not only a new decade, it's a new century, and it's a new millennium. You're going to have to be around to 3,000. I don't think any of us are going to make it. I mean, so there's something really strange about that, and exciting. And of course, you may remember that everyone thought terrible things were going to happen because of 0000. ATM machines were going to spew out money. Prison gates were going to unlock, and just nothing happened. But it's an exciting place. The biggest blowout, who could have predicted in 1900 that the biggest blowout would be the Big Cypress Seminole Reservation and Mar-a-Lago. And Mar-a-Lago, everyone was talking about the owner. He had only recently bought Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump, as the quote, it was always his presidential wannabe, but of course, he was a Democrat in 2000, not a Republican. But there was a rumor that I'm not making this up, there would be this dream ticket in 2000 of Donald Trump and Oprah Winfrey. I'm not sure anyone ever asked either one about running together. So Florida 2000, a little stats, 16 million residents. We gained 3 million in the decade of the 1990s alone. That's staggering. 24% growth rate. I mean, and we're now also the fastest growing state. Anyone here from California and New York? In the last 2 years, they will be soon. 51% female, almost 1 in 5, I think now there are 1 in 5 Floridians are 65 and older. That's almost like the Twilight Zone. I mean, no society in history has ever had more people over 65 than under 5. And there are some counties in Florida where there are like 5 counties where there are more people 70 and older than 10 and younger, which is the opposite of how the world used to be. Well, there it is. More Floridians aged 75, 84 than under age 5. 15% African American. One of the headlines was shocking in 2000. For the first time, there were more Hispanics in Florida than African Americans. That's also pretty amazing. Still a relatively small Asian population. It's growing. There was, I mentioned this before, a great deal of optimism. There was a book, I tried to read it, I thought it was unreadable, called The End of History. Just ponderous. But if I understood him correctly, is that then we're about to enter a golden age of light and harmony from after 2000. There will no longer be totalitarian governments. The world will live comfortably with liberal democracies. How did that work out, by the way? I'll ask you now. There's no right answer. I want you to be truthful. How many of you in 2023 are confident about the future of Florida? Five. That's the most I've ever had in one group, by the way. Seriously. I wish Governor DeSantis were here. I would love to get his take on this. I mean, this is not a good sign that Florida, and, you know, climate change, it seems like the Old Testament poxes are upon us. But there was a great deal of optimism in 2000. Also, how many University of Florida grads here? Boy, that's shocking. I know, there really is. University of Florida had about a 5-year period where several occasions they won the national championship in basketball and football. That's almost impossible to accomplish. And they had Tim Tebow, who was out of central casting. In the off-season, he was in the Philippines as a missionary with his parents, who were missionaries. Most all-American quarterbacks are not preaching the gospel in the Philippines in the summer. Florida State, in fact, it was a stunning orbit constellation of great college football teams. Florida State, Miami, and University of Florida all had championship seasons in that. They've all kind of fallen off a cliff after that, but it's, you had Bobby Bowden and Steve Spurrier. I mean, it was a remarkable sports decade. Many people think the University of Miami's 2021 team, 38 players drafted from that team. That is over the top. May have been the greatest collegiate team in football history. Or as cynics would say, the greatest team that never did die. At one time, I'm not making this up, when USF began football, collegiate football, I think in 1999, and there was a period, about a 3-week period in 2007, they knocked off the number 2 team in the nation, Auburn, and then the number 3 team, West Virginia, and at one time, we were ranked number 2nd. Now, we lost, I think, the last 4 games, fell off a cliff. This is a football state. So the 2000 election is, if you're a political junkie like I am, is just irresistible. It had a cast of characters. The stakes were high. The candidates were fascinating. Even the third-party candidates, they were as fascinating as they were significant in this case. So the Republicans nominated George W. Bush and his running mate from Wyoming, what was his name? Yes. And Al Gore and Bill Clinton, kind of a dream team. Al Gore and John Kerry. Is that right? No. In 2000. Al Gore, who was Gore's running mate? It's not that important. But Al Gore. That's going to bug me all night. It's going to roll around in my head. Now you're wondering what is Mel Gibson and freedom and have to do with this. If you think about Floridians, and I think you'll appreciate this as senior citizens. Looks like we're almost all senior citizens tonight. What drew so many of us to Florida? Beside, did anyone tell you there was no state income tax? May have been a factor. But there were, I don't think North Dakota has a state income tax either. I think the fact that it's a dream state, that there are second chances, but it's also, I think, this idea of freedom. That our grandparents, great-grandparents didn't have. I mean, if you lived in Iowa or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, and your family had been there 4 or 5 generations, your life is kind of prescribed. You're going to be a Lutheran or a Roman Catholic. You're going to take over the farm, or you're going to replace me at the Union. We've been Baptist for 5 generations. So when you move to Florida, those prohibitions and restrictions, you can change parties. In fact, one reason the Republican Party has been so successful is people that switch parties. In Florida, you don't even have to register as a Republican or Democrat. 1 in 3 Florida voters are independents today. To have been an independent in Illinois in 1880 would have been the equivalent of becoming an atheist. Lincoln was the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. The Democratic Party was the party of unions and the Confederacy. Those things, your churches and all those things. But with the new freedom, you can move in with someone, which you could not have done in rural Wisconsin, and live with someone. So freedoms in Florida, but that especially impacted Florida politics, especially the rise of the independent voters, which is about 1 in 3. Pretty stunning right now. Elian Gonzalez, and who would have predicted? I mean, if you were writing a novel and you had inserted Elian Gonzalez, people would say, yeah, it's just over the top. I mean, okay. But so in November 2000, in Cardenas, Cuba, Juan Gonzalez went to pick up his son, and he was divorced from his wife, and the principal at the school said, well, your wife picked him up 5 hours ago. Well, you know, she didn't tell me, and he looked and she was gone, and someone said they left on a boat, a small boat with about a dozen other people headed for Florida with Juan with her. And the boat near Florida ran into storms. 10 of the 12 died. One person remembered Juan's mother attaching him to a buoy in the outside Fort Lauderdale, and a fisherman the next day looked and he thought someone had played a cruel joke. They put a doll on this B-U-O-Y board, and it was Juan Gonzalez, Elian Gonzalez. So they take him to Miami to reunite him with his relatives there. And this became a flamethrower of an issue for people. I mean, I can't recall people getting angrier over the issue. So think about this. Which is the correct answer? And you're a mother, you're a mother in Cuba. I love my son so much, I'm willing to give him up for the blessings of liberty. Or, I will never allow politics to divide my family. They're completely opposite, but that's exactly the issue. And to Miami Cubans, he was more than a refugee. Because of this man, there were almost 1 million Hispanics in Florida at this time. Astonishing numbers of Cubans. If asked who's the most influential Floridian in modern Florida, it's not Flagler, it's not Plant, it's Fidel Castro. He's responsible for, not just for the Cubans there. And what was interesting is Cuban, and particularly Cuban Americans, think about this. If you're a third generation Cuban in 2000, you're 25 years old, Fidel is not your number one passion in life. You need insurance, you need a good job, you're worried about your family. And in fact, Bill Clinton in 1996 had picked off a lot of Cuban votes. Some people were predicting the Cuban vote in Florida is going to lean Democratic. But the Elian issue deflated that hope. Cubans pledged El Vestigo, revenge. And Carl Hyacin joked, I predict, this is long before the election, I predict that the election will be decided by one vote. It will be a foreign ballot, and it will be signed by one person, Elian Gonzalez. It almost came true. By the way, the picture of Fidel on the left, Fidel honeymoon in Miami Beach. La Caridad del Cobra. So to Cubans, this is the Virgin Mary returning to their cause. In the 1600s in Cuba, 3 fishermen called the Three Juans. One was a Native American, one was a slave, and one was a Cuban. And a storm was about to toss them into the sea, and an apparition of the Virgin Mary appeared, and she took the boat and floated it to land. And La Cachita, La Caridad del Cobra, becomes the patron saint of Cuba. It's a huge holiday. They smuggled her statue to Miami, and she is the symbol for Cubans in the 2000 election. Although she was not registered to vote. This is still a chilling scene when President Clinton and his Attorney General, a Miamian, Janet Reno, decide, it'd be interesting to have a vote here. They decide Elian should be with his biological father, not his estranged relatives in Cuba, or in Miami. And he would ship out. So how many of you think the government made the right decision by reunite? See, even the verb choice, is it reuniting or forcing one back? But how many of you think the government did the right decision? About 1 in 5, 1 in 5. It's tough. I mean, this issue has it all. It has politics, international policy,
Many are
family.
fathers with divorced spouses and have a settlement all about.
True, yes. You're right. Okay. Janet Reno said she had a lot of friends who would not speak to her for years. And one of the most touching stories I tell in the book, so Janet Reno had died. She had run for governor in 2002, and almost made it, but was defeated. And they're having a wake at her home. By the way, her mother and father were both journalists. Her mother built the home, every single item in the home. She built the roof, she installed plumbing, a tough woman. And the phone call says it's from the Cuban embassy. And the voice on the other said, President Castro wants to send his condolences to the family that helped reunite Juan, Elian and his father. The 2000 election, pandemonium, oh my God, I mean, you just can't, I think it's the last time I stayed up all night. I just, oh, wow, I mean, just ups and downs. No one will ever know who really won the election. The ballots were so screwed up. And by the way, in Palm Beach, which was the worst, the supervisor of elections was a Democrat, not a Republican. So this was not a right-wing conspiracy. But and it had to do with chads. They were changing machines, and so when you would put your stylus down to punch through, if it didn't fall out, the question is, was that a completed ballot? To me, it would seem so, but no, it had to be completely. That's simply one of the issues. The other issue is Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader won 25,000 votes in an election that was decided by a few hundred votes. That almost certainly would have gone to the Democrat. Not over yet. This was also the golden age of newspapers in 2000. Everyone subscribed to printed paper. They were still making money. No one was really doing online advertising, etc. And within a decade, the newspaper industry has simply cratered. Breaks my heart. I go through about 7 papers a day doing research. So a great deal of this was done reading dozens of Florida newspapers. The Brooks Brothers riot. What's the name of this guy here? With the white shirt. Roger Stone. Roger Stone. And apparently the Miami, they were recounting the Miami votes. And it looked like Bush had enough, Gore had enough momentum that he was going to take over. And the head of the Republican Party said famously, "Give me Roger Stone," like a hit man for the mafia. And Roger, they called it the Brooks Brothers riot, because Stone, who was always really well dressed, they all were wearing Brooks Brothers shirts and designer ties. And it was effective. They shut down the recounting. Catherine Harris. I'm guessing no one had heard of her prior to 2000. She's out of Central Casting as well. Beautiful. She's the granddaughter of the, what's the name of the University of Florida football stadium? Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. That was her grandfather. Fabulously wealthy. She studied art in France and Greece, spoke 4 languages, but she clearly, as Secretary of State, someone had to tell her that night, you realize you're responsible for figuring out this mess. And she said, well, no one ever told me. I mean, again, why is this? And it's a month of melodrama. Both sides bring in the best lawyers in the land. And ultimately, Bush wins the election. This event, if you were doing a movie, tell me this wouldn't be a great starting point in the movie. I can't tell you what the movie's about. It will give it away. So, in 2001, at the Longboat Key Tennis Resort, this is a really fancy place, by the way. It's no longer there. But this was 5 stars for cuisine and everything. And basically the past and future of the Republican Party are meeting there in 2000. You've got President George W. Bush. You have his son, who happens to be the governor of Florida, is there. You have Bob Martinez from Tampa, who is there. And Bush playing the menu. It was Tex-Mex. And they could look out and see Catherine Harris's house. And the big subject of the night was sports, was baseball. Bob Martinez almost signed for $500 a major league contract. The President of the United States came back from World War II, starred, and Yale's team. George W. Bush owned the Texas Rangers. So baseball is the conversation of the night. And as we're leaving that night, so I'm interviewing Mary Jane Martinez, the governor's wife, and she tells me as I'm going out, Gary, look at this photograph. Do you see anything strange about that? And so Jeb Bush signed this big heart for her. He said he had a crush on her, put an arrow through it, and then, you can't see it there, but it says 9/10/01. 9/10/01. The eve of 9/11. Oh, wow. What do you think that menu is worth, by the way? Signing by those people. I'm serious. How many millions of dollars? So the next day, President Bush is in Sarasota, Emmer Booker Elementary School. He's reading My Pet Goat when his press secretary informs him first that one tower's down, and then when he tells them both towers are down because of plane crashes, he realized this was serious. This was a nightmare. And you can see his face is kind of dumbstruck there. Look at many people think this is the last time newspapers were relevant. And CNN seemed to have the future. People reading newspapers didn't want to know what happened 24 hours ago. They wanted to know what happened 5 minutes ago. CNN is now on 24 hours a day. But it's the last time anyone can remember people were collecting that front page. They were buying every copy. They had to print extra copies. Why is Florida involved in an event that takes place in New York City? Most of the terrorists, and even then, is that the right word? I think it's the right word. But the politics of this is, some groups thought that was being too critical. Why Florida? Because you can be a Middle Easterner and no one really cared. We're a nation of strangers. We're a state of strangers. They were doing research, by the way, at the Venice Public Library, Fort Lauderdale Public Library, and actually Googling up how do you blow up a building with a plane crash. But no one's monitoring this in 2000. They were also going to girly shows at night. I mean, it's another morbid, to say the least. Switching topics. 9/11 had a huge impact on Florida and the nation. Still lingers. This period, 2000-2010, one of the reasons it's going to be remembered, it's perhaps Tampa Bay's last hurrah. Every gubernatorial election from 1998 to 2010 had a Tampa Bay candidate at the top. and sometimes both. So in 1998, it was Bill McBride, I think. And in 2002, actually, it's not, Bill McBride runs in 2002. His wife is Alex Sink, who runs in 2010. Both of them narrowly lost. Bill McBride is, if you wanted a hero, so he's at the University of Florida on athletic and academic scholarship. He's 5'8" Kappa. The starting fullback on the football team gets into law school, quits law school to sign up for Vietnam as a ranger. I mean, not a lot of people running for governor have those credentials. And his wife is the head of, I think, the Florida branch of Bank of America. 2004, which was a presidential year, is also the most intense year of hurricane activity in Florida. Within a span of 40 days, 4 major hurricanes struck Florida. How many of you were here in '04? We had just moved over from Tampa in '03, and we were living in the Snell House, this old house on USF St. Pete campus, for evacuation there. We were so lucky. Hurricane Charlie was headed right through Tampa Bay, and it was a dry run for Hurricane Ian. It practically the same path. They veered at the last minute. The hit kind of gored at most places. But this was, it helps to have your brother, that the brother of the president is governor of Florida, and the president needs Florida to win the 2004 election. And what's fascinating is everyone gives George W. Bush an A for his handling of the 2004 hurricanes. What happened the next year in New Orleans? It all collapsed. Look at the headlines. The cartoons. Florida, the plywood state. We are here. This is a touching story in the book. Any of you ever eat at the Old Sugar Hotel in Cluestown, thank you. Cluestown, which is a sugar town. U.S. Sugar in the 1920s built this magnificent wooden hotel. Got the best bar I've ever seen. And this lady, who's a school teacher there, was going to be married the day Hurricane G was coming through. And the only place they could figure out to hold the wedding was the hotel. And they invited the entire community there. And it's a really feel-good story. People come together. They also fly apart in hurricanes. But, you can see the impact of the hurricane there. Sorry. The village, President Bush began a tradition. If you're running as a Republican for statewide office, your first stop is the villages. How many of you have been to villages? It's utterly fascinating. I gave a talk there in 2006, and I mean, fascinating. The photo on the left may have caused John Kerry the election. Even the New York Times said about the photo, whom among us doesn't love windsurfing? Probably not the picture you want to get across that you're a blue-collar candidate. It was interesting, by the way, during the election, he found out he was Jewish. The family, his grandfather was a Jewish immigrant, but he had converted, and they wanted to keep it a secret. And someone was doing DNA testing and found out. But the New York Times also said, he looks French. In 2004, Betty Castor runs for the U.S. Senate. 04 is the greatest political year in that decade. You've got the presidential election. The senatorial election is fascinating. Betty Castor is a dream candidate. She was once my boss at USF. After college, she taught school in Africa for 4 or 5 years. She led the first all-women's expedition to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro. The first woman elected Tampa City Council, and in 1977, she goes for a meeting, informal meeting, Tampa City Council at the University Club in Tampa, and the mayor D tells her, what?
She's not allowed in.
You're not allowed in. Women are not allowed as members or as guests of the club, only as waitresses. And she leaves and she changes the law, basically. I write, she's the right person. She had the right stuff at the wrong time. She's running against an even dreamier candidate, Mel Martinez. If you wanted to write the credentials of a dream senatorial candidate, tell me you can beat this. First of all, he's born, and he comes at age 10, I believe, in what was called the Pedro Pan program, the Peter Pan program. The Catholic Church managed to pull this off. Human families, but what you were doing is you were giving your son or daughter away. And you might never see them again, but they were going to be free. I mean, how many mothers? That's tough. And he came along, he eventually reunited with his parents, but to his great break, he went to Orlando rather than Miami. In Miami, he could have fit in easily as a Cuban. In Orlando, there aren't a lot of Hispanics there yet. Most of the Hispanics are in the neighboring town. And everyone loved Mel. I mean, he was just a great guy, athletic, smart, a lawyer, and he had been holding a cabinet level post with the Bush administration, and they run him for governor. He's the only person. It's an ugly race, particularly over, well, Marco Rubio was also running statewide for the first time. This is the ugly. How many of you even remember Stanley Arias? He was an engineering professor at USF Tampa. And I still don't know truth from fiction. If he was a terrorist, it seemed clear he was raising money to give to a Palestinian charity for the families of suicide bombers. Now that doesn't sound good, but I never met him. But at any rate, Betty couldn't get him off her back. The only issue in the campaign is, why didn't you fire him? Well, I can't fire a professor because he's Palestinian. He hadn't committed a crime. Later, the FBI did arrest him, and he was deported. But Castor lost the election because of, and Stanley Arias did the most insane thing. Before he was a national name, he was invited to appear on the Bill O'Reilly show. Not a good idea. And he just got crushed by O'Reilly, and the next day, he's a national story. So the day after the election, the New York Times has a story saying, you want to understand why George W. Bush won re-election? Don't go to Orlando, don't go to Tampa, don't go to Miami, go to Pasco County. I think I spend more time on Pasco County in the book than on Tampa or St. Pete. Pasco County becomes the new ideal during this time. It had almost no people 50 years ago. It now has 500,000 people. And it's very conservative. And they vote. And anyone know the largest city in Pasco County today, by the way? Zephyr Hills. Zephyr Hills. Wesley Chapel would be, except for one issue. It's not a city. Most of Pasco County is just sprawl. The other thing that's happening this decade, every day, 1,000 people are coming to Florida every day. For a while there, several hundred were leaving every day. That's still true, by the way. But that's one reason Florida, give me an idea when you want me to start wrapping things up. I can go on to midnight. This looks like a crowd that's not going away, if I can read my audience. So what does this have to do with 2010? I'm in New York City 40 years ago, researching World War II. And I go to a bound volume of New York Sun newspapers, and the first story I see begins, "Stark is gauche." Do you think the word stark and gauche were ever used in the same sentence? Stark, a gold rush town as a result of the national emergency, is as fantastic a spot as America now presents. So I use that saying, so if you were an outsider studying cities, and you came to Florida in 2004, 2005, what place would astonish you? It's not going to be St. Petersburg or Tampa. It's going to be this new way of living. Adult, active senior communities. The term never existed before. It's going to be places like Seaside. How many of you have ever been to Seaside up in the Panhandle? A new urban community. It's going to be Wesley Chapel, where it had ex-urban. It really doesn't have a downtown, but it has a lot of people there. And that's the fascinating thing about Florida during this era. We were living in very, very different places because we had choices. Well, that's the question I just asked. One of the places you might have visited and is now gone is a trailer park as well. Florida had, in the 1990s, more trailer parks and trailers than any state in America. I think we're now number 3 or 4. And one very simple reason. Yeah, what? Well, they've blown away, but more importantly, what? Land value, exactly. It's more profitable to grow condos than trailer parks. And trailers are, the ones in Florida are moving to poorer counties and they're moving places like Tennessee and Kentucky. But there was a time when there were trailer parks with oceanfront views. Are you kidding me? I mean, seriously. This was Walton Manors. Why is this place famous? A Carl Hyacin novel, Striptease, is set in a trailer park in there. So in 2002, okay, you can read. 1 in 10 residents at this time, that's astonishing. 1 in 10 residents was a mobile home. Not even close to that now. The numbers have really declined. Pinellas County was the number 1 for a long time. The biggest boom ever. So what would you call that? If you were looking at a microscope at an amoeba or something, but that's, wow. I mean, Florida's got a little bit of everything in terms of living. By the way, that's Ward Morehouse who wrote that article about Stark. The most fascinating trailer court in Florida is not even close. How many of you have been to Briny Breezes? Oh man, next time you're in Palm Beach, it's between 2, I swear, 40, 50 story condos. But it's about 40 acres and they're trailers. All with both intercoastal views and Atlantic Ocean views. And in 2006, someone offered everyone with a unit. These are not fancy trailers at all. One, I think, $600,000. And it barely passed. One person said, my son's a doctor. I like it here. I'm 80 years old. What am I going to do with $1 million? But I'm not making this up. I don't know if I have this in here. No, I don't. You think I'm making this up. I'm not. What's it now? It could well likely become what in 10 years? Anyone been reading about this? No. Well, the Donald Trump presidential library. They're offering to buy it for like $50 million. It's gonna take. No, I'm serious. Look, Google it up when you get home. And then I think every person would get $1 million buyout with everyone. Well, these are some new ways of living in Florida at this time, or they're amoebas, and I can't tell the difference. So I'm in my office in 2006 or 2007. The Great Recession has just begun. And a guy named George Packer said, could I interview you? I don't have any idea who George Packer is. And he comes and says, I need a metaphor. I'm writing a story about the Great Recession in Florida. I said, well, in many ways, it's a Ponzi state. In the idea that as long as 1,000 newcomers come every day, Florida is booming. Everyone needs sod, so the nursery does well, the electrician, the contractors do well. What happens when they stop coming? And no one ever talks about that. And that's exactly what happened in 2007. And so someone sent me a copy of New Yorker magazine, and I don't realize George Packer is their big news guy there. He does give me credit for the title, the Ponzi state, but the Chamber of Commerce was not happy with my metaphor of the day. Okay. Nerd question of the night. Can everyone read that? All right, I don't need to record. All right, let's do the first one first. Largest city south of Tampa, St. Pete. Is it Bradenton, Fort Myers, Sarasota, or Naples?
Naples.
It's none of the above. Who says none of the above? The answer is? Yes, we have an answer. You have the prize, and they're keeping the prize on ice for you. Cape Coral, which wasn't even a city in 1955. Two brothers created Cape Coral. Cape Coral has, I think, 225,000 people. Sarasota is not even the largest city in Sarasota County. What is it? Northport, which wasn't a city in 1960. Again, another instant city. So what's the largest city on Florida's east coast between Jacksonville and Fort Lauderdale? Port St. Lucie. Port St. Lucie, which is another instant community. I think the New York Mets have their spring training there. And the answer is Cape Coral and Port St. Lucie. Both of them, almost 250,000 people. By the way, the convertible, was that 57, 58, 59? I mean, is that as good as it gets on Highway 41? These are some of the connections. Everyone in Cape Coral has a water view. It doesn't mean waterfront. They coined the term water view. I mean, these are just, you'd swear someone, a mad artist has created these. Marco Island's a fascinating place. Well, I need to move on. The villages, pickleball. It's the pickleball capital of Florida. Any pickleball players here? I still play tennis. And I denigrated pickleball until I played it. It's harder than I thought. It's a legit sport. My apologies. Al Hawken. Now, is this a quote of a confident developer to Florida Trade? He says at the bottom about development, you can't stop it. There's no power on earth that can stop it, except, of course, the Great Recession. And his corporation actually went out of business. He was bankrupt. He was a remarkable character. He's those towns south of Fort Myers, Bonita Springs, and it was his idea. You come in with expensive housing, sandwiched around a golf course. And golf absolutely took off during this decade, and it's absolutely bottomed out now for one simple reason. People our age, 15 years ago, were golfing, we're not golfing anymore. And there's no Tiger Woods to whip up the enthusiasm. So Pelican Reserve, the Colony, look at that. And a lot of these places, with lawsuits still pending, they're taking out the golf course and putting housing where the knife hole was. And people are suing them, hey, I bought this because of the golf course. This is a fascinating piece. New York Times printed this. It's what Florida looks like in March. It doesn't, that it's no longer Florida, it's New Yorkers and people from Canada coming down here, and you can see the buffalo wings, and they're bringing their foods with them. If you had told me, I mean, if you had put money down in 1950, what kind of odds would you have had? 1950, I think New York had 8 million people, and Florida had about 2 million. So a 4-to-1 ratio. And in 2014, Florida surpassed New York. That's impossible. I mean, it really is. And since then, last year, 50,000 New Yorkers moved to Florida because of taxes and cheap housing. And Stand Your Ground also passed at this time. It's a remarkably creative decade. I'm going to run through these. I know we're getting on time. How many have ever seen the movie Sunshine State? That would be a good movie to show here at the museum. That is a fabulous Florida film. I'll give away the opening. We've got three golfers, all New Yorkers, all Jewish. Alan King is one of them. So they've got their New York accents, and they're talking about, and they're developers. And they said, as if we were God, we made this. And someone said, a golf course? He said, no, a dream. And the movie Sunshine State. Bonita Springs, I've got Audubon calculates that the average golf course uses 312,000 gallons of water a day. That is serious water expenditure. I don't know environmentally whether we can sustain that. So in 2005, and this would be equally relevant here. What will $1 million buy? And the answer, not nearly as much as you think. And that would be true today as well. The rise of the Seminoles, Hard Rock Cafe, one of the greatest stories ever. I typically begin the audience, and I've had people ask me, please don't tell that story again. But James Billy, first of all, what a arc of a life. He's born an orphan on a chip farm in Dania, Florida. He never knew his father. His father was a soldier in World War II. The women, Seminole women, took him as a baby to drown him because he was not full-blooded Seminole. And a Seminole woman rescued him and said, I predict this boy will grow up to greatness. 3 tours of Vietnam. Seminoles don't have to go to Vietnam. 3 tours of Vietnam. He comes back. He's voted, at a time when the Seminoles are just desperately poor, he's voted chairman of the Seminole tribe. And he consults a medicine man. What must I do to win the faith of my people? He said, son, you must go out and do 3 things. You must, or 2 things. You must capture, kill, and eat a Florida panther. 3 things. He did. Promptly arrested for killing an endangered species. His trial was in Clewiston, the trial of the century. And he's acquitted. And he's coming out of the courthouse. He pleaded, it was a religious purification ceremony on sovereign land. And he's coming out of the courthouse. There's like 200 journalists. What's the first question they ask?
Why'd you do it?
No. What's Panther taste like? He said it tasted like a cross between bald eagle and a manatee. Tell me he doesn't have a sense of humor. Environmentalists hate that story. The origins of the Hard Rock Cafe. So in 1990, no, it was 2000. It was 1980. I was in Italy that year. They did an excavation of downtown Tampa for a new hotel, and they discovered Seminole skeletons. James Billy, Seminole chair, says, if you will give us a plot of land, I will build a Seminole cultural center. That plot of land is now Hard Rock Cafe. I'm gonna go through, well, I got this twice. I forgot I had this in there. This would be a good place to stop. We have time for questions, be honest.
Yeah,
Oh.
absolutely.
Well, I'll go through these quickly. I don't think there are many more. So in my mind, most authentic Floridians, Bobby Bowden, Steve Spurrier, Governor Jeb Bush, and Jimmy Buffett. All born somewhere else. And yet they seem about as Florida as you can imagine. Diane Roberts, 8th generation Floridian, can anyone top that? Said, Florida is a place where people have projected their own dreams and agenda onto our state. Very true. And I love the one at the bottom, I can't remember who said it, but most Floridians have seen so much growth, they might as well be outsiders, because it doesn't seem like the same state. The political races, so in 2006, tell me you've heard this before, Charlie Crist runs for governor. He's a Republican in 2006. He's about as all-American, all-Floridian as you can imagine. He's held more statewide offices than anyone in Florida history. Educational commissioner, attorney general. And he's running against a Tampa lawyer named Jim Davis, who's kind of an all-American boy. And Chris easily wins the election. Davis is out of politics. I think of two Democrats who are still relatively young, who would be the leaders of the party, Jim Davis and St. Petersburg's Peter Rudy Wallace. Both of them dropped out. So there's no future in the Democratic Party in Florida. And they may be right for the near future there. Chris is a thing, I don't, as you know, Chris just ran for election for governor as a Democrat. Only person in Florida history to do that. I think it's probably over for Charlie. He's in his early 60s now, which is not over, but that's Jim Davis. Okay, Florida trivia question. Glenn Margolis was the last Florida Democratic Speaker of the House. No, President of the Senate. Last Democratic President of the Senate, 1990s. Peter Rudy Wallace was the last Democratic Speaker of the House, 1990s, out of office. Florida's last Democratic governor? Actually, Lawton would be the logical answer, but Lawton died like a week before the office ended. Wayne Nixon, lest we forget, Wayne Nixon was the last, although he was, if I put elected, it would be, Lawton Childs was really something. We won't likely see anything like that. In 2008, it looked like, and that's a deliberate misspelling, by the way, his name is C-R-I-S-T, not Christ. But it was rumored that he was going to be the running mate for John McCain, and it's probably no coincidence he got married, because there were rumors why such a handsome guy got married. Alex Sink versus Rick Scott. Rick Scott spent $75 million of his own money to become governor. I mean, that's That is serious money. And Sink almost won. Florida terms Republican. So the guy on the left may be the most famous Republican in Pinellas County history. The picture of the black and white. Bonus point.
Kramer.
You know what they do?
Sure, Kramer.
They call him Mr. Republican in Tallahassee. I interviewed him a day before he died in '03. Bill Kramer. How many of you remember? The highway, interstate from Tampa to St. Pete is called the Bill Kramer Highway. He was the first Republican congressman elected in the South since Reconstruction. He was from St. Petersburg. Who's this guy here? He's the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. The guy in the oil painting there holding the book.
Kirk?
Claude Kirk, who said that? Claude Kirk. Claude Kirk is a weird character. Bad year to be a governor or a politician is 1968. America was flying apart. And in Florida, if you can imagine this, all the teachers in Florida went out on strike. Even though it was against the law, it's a statewide teacher strike. And they blamed it on Kirk, and ugly repercussions. It's now illegal to do that. It was illegal to do it then. Principals who supported their teachers were also fired, by the way. Most teachers got their jobs back. Marco Rubio, I bet if this were 2000, if this were, not a single person in this room had ever heard of Marco Rubio. Puerto Ricans, a group, not a big group here, but Orange County, Osceola County, hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans. Most of them born in New York. First of all, they're not immigrants. Puerto Ricans are Americans, but they're migrants. And many of them work at the entertainment industry there. And there was once cheap housing in Osceola County. In 1950, there were 4,500 Puerto Ricans. There are now almost 1 million. Probably 1 million if you're counting their American-born children. This is the most famous bro hug in American history, or at least Florida history. So the Great Recession had just begun in 2008. The recession's already here. Barack Obama has won the election. So it's January 2009, and he realizes Florida is hurting, so he comes to make a political stop in Fort Myers to give money to Florida for the Great Recession. And Charlie Crist is the governor, and Obama finished his talk. They both walk toward one another, and Obama gives him a bro hug. And it's the end of Charlie's career, really. As a Republican. He never recovered as a Republican. And it's all because of that. And a week later, the Tea Party is born. And he's the first casualty of the Chris runs, he was going to run for he could have easily won re-election, but decided to run for the U.S. Senate in 2008 and is annihilated. Venezuelans is also a huge group now, not here, but Miami-Dade. There are two cities, Weston and Doral. They call Doral Venezuela. There's so many Venezuelans there. And what's their national food dish? You want to know? Bonus points. Arepa, kind of corn cake with meat filling. Palm Coast, sometimes called Palm Jersey, is Flagler County, south of, just south of St. Augustine. Apparently there's like 3,000 policemen living there from New Jersey, retired. I don't want to argue, I'm going to run. Lehigh Acres, anyone spend any time in Lehigh Acres? A What a basket case. Poorly designed city in the first place. Didn't do well with Florida weather, and the Great Recession just wiped it out. I mean, it was considered the most beleaguered city in Florida. Paul Reyes, who I knew in St. Peter's, we used to have coffee together, he was what was called a trasher. Bad job of going in after foreclosures and mowing the lawn, which is often 4 feet high now, with anthills, and inside, in revenge, people would leave all sorts of booby prizes and a bad job. And he wrote a book about working in Florida during that time. The most poignant story I heard, deputies from the sheriff's department had to deliver the foreclosure notice. People aren't happy when they get foreclosed, and so they often, carried weapons, and two people would come. A guy the deputy knocks on the door, the woman opens, and her husband said, "Honey, who is it?" And the sheriff says to the woman, "You didn't tell him, did you?" She said, "No." He's about to be foreclosed. I mean, it's some very sad stories. Let's leave it there. We have time for a question or two. I won't be offended if we don't. A question.
As an educator, where do you think education is going to be in Florida in the next 5, 10 years?
I'm very concerned about education, particularly, again, I don't want to politicize this, but the governor has politicized it. And it seemed to me, I spent a lot of my life in higher ed, and I can't say I know K through 12 as well, but we've got a pretty good educational system. And I find it dangerous making decisions from above about books, etc. So the politicalization, this is not a healthy thing. And I just don't know a happy ending here. Yes?
Talking about education and the stipulations with state colleges, is there going to be a turnaround where less students are going to be going there from out of state, and that will also bring it down?
You're right, we do have a lot of out-of-state students, and tuition is fairly inexpensive compared to other states. Florida is going to keep growing. I mean, there's no question about it. The problem now, I think, is this just in. This is a really expensive place now. I mean, this is no longer a place where you can get a waterfront view and a trailer park for $75 a month. I mean, that's going to be a real challenge, is affordability. And we're not built out. I mean, if you've ever driven up the spine of the state, cattle country, there's a lot of land left. Everyone wants to live near the water. That's the issue. And I don't see a solution to the insurance crisis. If the governor asked me, my answer would be, if you live on an island in Florida or you live on the coast of Florida, you should be on your own. I don't think we should subsidize wealthy people who live on the water. Now, again, everyone wants to live on the water. I mean, does anyone have a solution to the insurance crisis? It's just, it's expensive to live on the water. And now, I mean, think about this. Sanibel in 1947 had a single telephone. It had a ferry. You couldn't drive to Sanibel. It had a ferry with one telephone. If you wanted to escape from reality, you went there. There's no escaping from reality now with your iPad and computer and cellular telephone. So you can, that's one reason wealthy people are moving down here. You can be a CEO of a firm. I'm worried about middle class and working class Floridians. That seems to be the real crisis. If you were here 20 years ago, this was a pretty inexpensive state. It's not an inexpensive, so that's going to be, we've got a lot of challenges. Number one, I would say, is environmental. And does anyone have a solution to sea level rise? No. I mean, remember the story of King, of King Canute. King Canute wanted his courtiers to go down and stop the tide. Well, we can't, there's no solution, you can't put up seawalls that high, and they'll just come around the seawall. So, I mean, wow, and it strikes me, we're not spending enough time discussing this, both at the state level and the neighborhood level. This is not just the cabinets, and boy, we've got some serious issues. But let's enjoy it while we're here. I feel that our children and grandchildren, I think they're the ones who are going to have a hard time unless they inherit these expensive homes we live in. And then you've got to pay, the insurance and taxes. But so, wow. I mean, this would be an interesting session for the museum, people to talk about ideas to pass along to the governor and others. Because I don't think anyone has a solution. It's not like I'm being critical of the governor. These are gravity-defying solutions that just have little.
I live in a mobile home community
Still do.
that the majority of residents have no insurance.
Wow.
They just decided no insurance.
And where's this?
Lake Summerall Resort, 110 Lake Summerall.
Okay. Interesting. Is it, would you call it a community in the sense that everyone knows one another?
248 units,
Uh-huh.
most of them snowbirds.
Yeah.
So, and so most of them say, I'm in my third quarter, and so I don't have too long to live, so why should I spend my money for insurance?
I don't know if you saw that story in the Times about 2 weeks ago about the mobile home community where they sold it to a financial institution. So basically they're renting from that institution and the price just went up sky high, mostly because it's going to be there. Someone could do a great book on mobile homes, man. Final questions or thoughts? Yes, one final question.
Yeah, why do you think so many of the January 6th people were from here?
Moved here. Well, it's very simple. We're a state of strangers, and if you're up to no good, most people aren't going to ask you, so what are your intentions? So seriously, if at the time, I think 1 in 4 Floridians was a native, and in South Florida, even fewer, it's the perfect place to commit or plan a crime. You would think some signs such as, I don't need to learn to land the plane, I only need to take off, might be provocative, but yeah, I think the answer is pretty simple. Thank you for coming tonight.